Paris, 1809. A man known for escaping from virtually every prison in France was now voluntarily surrendering himself to the authorities in Paris. It was something that intrigued everyone. Such audacity. A man capable of unimaginable feats for his time stood before the French authorities. All of it was part of a plan that would later change the course of modern criminal investigation forever, inspiring the creation of institutions and scientific methods for hunting criminals. From criminal to remarkable detective, Eugène François Vidocq became a model and inspiration for characters created by great writers such as Auguste Dupin by Edgar Allan Poe and Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. He revolutionized the Sûreté, one of the first modern investigative police forces, which would later influence the creation of Scotland Yard, and a century later, the FBI. Vidocq used disguises, infiltration, and behavioral analysis techniques far ahead of his time. But before we understand how Eugène François Vidocq became the man who invented modern criminal investigation, you need to understand who he was before all of that. Because this man spent the first 34 years of his life on the other side of the law. He escaped from more than 20 prisons. He disguised himself as a nun, a beggar, a merchant, even a nobleman. How does a man who spent his entire life escaping the law become the law itself? The early years. It all begins in Arras, northern France, in 1775. Vidocq was born the son of a baker. From a stable, lower-middle-class family, he had everything a young man needed for a quiet, respectable life. But at 13, he stole the family's silver, sold it all in a single day, and was arrested by his own father. At 14, he stole 2,000 francs from the bakery's cash box and ran away from home, planning to emigrate to America. The plan failed. He simply didn't have enough money to pay for the voyage. At the port, he met a sailor, went drinking with him, and woke up with no money and no ticket. So he did what seemed, under the circumstances, like the most rational thing possible. He joined a traveling circus. And here, the story already reveals the kind of man Vidocq would become. At the circus, he was first hired as a stable boy, tending horses, and later performed as a Caribbean cannibal, pretending to eat raw meat to entertain the crowd. For a while, the act drew good audiences. Then one day, monkeys attacked him, broke his nose while learning acrobatics, and during a performance, he refused to eat a live chicken. For that refusal, he was beaten and expelled from the circus. Faced with these setbacks, Vidocq returned to Arras and briefly reconciled with his family, but soon ran away again. He joined a puppet theater troupe which quickly fell apart after he was caught in an affair with the puppet master's wife. After several more twists in his wandering life, Vidocq gave up and returned home once again. His mother was a kind and caring figure, one of the few sources of warmth in his turbulent life. Even at a young age, Vidocq was a troublemaker. He enjoyed fighting, drinking, and women. Eventually, an opportunity arose for him to enlist in the army, and his father welcomed the idea, seeing it as a way to bring discipline into his son's life. Vidocq's time in the military was short and chaotic, marked by repeated desertions and transfers between regiments. At one point, he even briefly defected to the Austrian side, fighting against the French before quickly returning to his compatriots. In just 6 months, he fought 15 duels and killed 2 men. He earned the nickname Reckless. This path led him to the Armée Roulante, a roaming militia made up largely of petty criminals and deserters who, using false papers and stolen uniforms, attached themselves to regular army units. They hoped to eventually secure official positions, but in the meantime lived off whatever spoils of war they could find. He deserted, returned, deserted again, fought briefly for the enemy, then came back to France when an amnesty was declared. At 19, he married a woman who soon betrayed him. When he discovered the affair, he left once more. And it was at that point that Vidocq's life fully entered the world of crime. Life in the world of crime. Between 1795 and 1809, Vidocq entered and left prisons more times than any record could properly keep track of. His first conviction came after he assaulted his employer's lover, setting off a long chain of imprisonments for various crimes. He forged a document to free an innocent prisoner. He was caught, escaped, joined a band of smugglers, was arrested again for lacking proper papers. In 1798, he was sentenced to 8 years in the galleys. The galleys were ships repurposed as prisons. Chains on the wrists, chains on the ankles, and heavy lead boots. Most men who entered those places never left the same way. And yet, Vidocq escaped. He was not fond of hard labor. He escaped first disguised as a sailor, later as a milkman, and eventually as a nun. Although the last of these attempts briefly succeeded, he was recaptured the following year and sent back to the galleys, this time in Toulon. At the beginning of the 19th century, he escaped again, was arrested again, escaped again. In his memoirs, Vidocq would later boast that he had escaped from every galley in France and from more than 20 prisons. He was recaptured, escaped again, sent to La Force, the most brutal prison in Paris. He escaped from there as well. One detail worth noting is that Vidocq was not a typical criminal. He did not murder, rob, or torture. Most of his crimes were documentary in nature: forgeries, false identities, disguises. Above all else, he possessed an extraordinary ability to become someone else. And it was precisely that skill which, 14 years later, would make him the best investigator France had ever seen. But before that, there was still one more chapter. 1809. Vidocq was 34 years old and back in the galleys. And for the first time in his life, something different happened. He stopped. He did not attempt to escape. He did not forge documents. He did not ask to speak with a judge. He asked to speak with the police. When the officer entered the cell, Vidocq made a bold proposal. For months, he began providing privileged information about the criminal underworld. Vidocq certainly knew better than most which buttons to push to extract a confession because he understood the mind of a criminal. He knew their nicknames, their methods, their addresses, their plans. He knew them because he had lived among them for 15 years. And if the police set him free, he promised to deliver them all. No one took him seriously the first time, but Vidocq insisted, and the authorities, with nothing to lose, agreed to a test. He was transferred to a regular prison, supposedly as an ordinary inmate. Within a few months, he had provided information that led to the arrest of dozens of criminals who had been wanted for years. The authorities were so satisfied with his work that, in 1811, on the condition that he continue to act as an informant outside prison, they helped him stage an escape from La Force. This increased his credibility in the streets among the criminal gangs he was tasked with infiltrating. In less than a year, he was promoted from paid informant to the head of a newly formed unit, the Brigade de Sûreté, which Napoleon declared a national security force in 1813. The police were unsettled by Vidocq, not because of the criminals he captured, but because of his method. Vidocq had not tortured anyone. He had not used force. He had done none of the things the police of that era believed were necessary. He had simply talked, observed, and remembered everything. The first detective in history. In October 1812, Eugène François Vidocq was appointed head of the Brigade de la Sûreté. What he did with this position was absolutely unprecedented. First, he recruited his team. He did not hire former soldiers, seek well-intentioned nobles, or recruit law students. He recruited ex-criminals. The logic was simple, yet at the same time unsettling. To catch a criminal, you need to think like a criminal, and Vidocq knew exactly where to find people like that. He then created something that had never existed before, a central archive containing over 60,000 files. Each file documented the alias, physical appearance, previous crimes, and modus operandi of each thief, whether a forger, murderer, or known swindler. He was the first to realize that criminals repeat their own patterns, and that someone who understands these patterns can predict their next move. Vidocq also visited crime scenes to examine evidence on site, something no police officer had done before. He compared boots to tracks on the ground, and returned bullets to gun barrels to identify the weapon used in each crime. He used handwriting analysis to track forgers and implemented indelible ink and tamper-proof paper to prevent official documents from being forged. In 1822, he conducted the first documented ballistic analysis in history. Over the years, with his team of ex-criminals dressed in civilian clothes, he captured more than 4,000 criminals in a city where the police had previously been unable to catch a single one. Vidocq's departure from the Sûreté in 1827 remains a mystery. It is unclear whether he was dismissed or left voluntarily. The fact is, he left as a wealthy man. However, subsequent projects involving ex-criminal employees failed, nearly bankrupting him. He returned to the Sûreté in 1830, and during his absence, crime rates had risen dramatically. Vidocq's second term lasted just over 6 months. Facing widespread criticism and pressure for greater transparency, the Paris prefecture began removing employees with criminal records. In November 1832, Vidocq was forced to resign again. Shortly afterward, he founded the world's first private detective agency, the Bureau de Renseignements. It handled corporate intelligence, offering debt collection and due diligence services. Through a subscription model, companies could pay to access a database derived from the extensive filing system Vidocq had created while at the Sûreté, allowing them to perform background checks on potential partners and clients. At the same time, the agency also dealt with what it called intimate or confidential matters. This included everything from spying on spouses suspected of extramarital affairs, locating missing loved ones, usually daughters from respectable families who ran away with disreputable suitors, and recovering personal belongings. The police, under the clear impression that the Bureau de Renseignements was encroaching on their territory, repeatedly tried to shut it down, seizing Vidocq's files and taking him to trial in 1837 and 1843. Although he was acquitted, the agency lost many clients and was ultimately forced to close. Vidocq lived a life of highs and lows, but he remained celebrated by the public for all his achievements and audacity.